May 14, 1944. Workshop Barracks 4, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. The hum was not human. It was a synchronized electric drone that vibrated through the pine floorboards and up into Hanako's straw sandals. The air inside the long wooden barracks smelled of ozone, machine oil, and fresh, unblemished cotton. Hanako Yamada, formerly a clerk for the Imperial Navy Logistics Office on Saipan, stood frozen at her assigned station. Before her sat the beast, a black cast-iron Singer 1591, gleaming under the overhead electric bulbs that burned wastefully in the middle of the day. "Foot on the pedal, Yamada," the floor supervisor, a sturdy WAC corporal named Miller, barked, pointing a clipboard. "We have a quota, 50 pillowcases by chow time." Hanako stared at the pedal. In Tokyo, her mother had a treadle machine, a precious heirloom that required rhythm and sweat. This had a cord plugging into the wall, electricity, for prisoners, to sew pillowcases. She hesitated, her foot hovering. The concept of diverting precious voltage to a prisoner's needlework was strategic insanity. It was wasteful. It was arrogant. "It will bite," Hanako whispered, her English broken, eyes wide. "Only if you hesitate," Miller sighed, tapping the table. "Drive it." Hanako pressed down. The needle blurred, a silver piston of terrifying speed, stitching a perfect seam faster than a heartbeat. The sheer, effortless power of it made her stomach turn. If they could waste this power on her, what did they have left for the front lines? 6 weeks earlier, somewhere in Montana, the rhythmic clatter of steel wheels against the track was the only constant in a world that had turned upside down. Hanako Yamada sat upright on the bench seat, her spine not touching the upholstery. Upholstery. That was the first contradiction. She had expected a cattle car, a wooden box smelling of manure and fear, like the ones used to move supplies in Manchukuo. She had expected to be packed in standing room only, subjected to the elements, treated as the cargo of a defeated nation. Instead, she was in a Pullman troop sleeper. It was utilitarian, yes, 3 tiers of bunks, narrow aisles, but it was heated. A vent near the floor breathed warm, dry air that smelled of coal dust and metal. "Where are we?" whispered breathless Keiko, a young nurse who had been captured alongside Hanako in the caves. Keiko was shivering, not from cold, but from the terrifying unknown. Hanako looked out the window. The landscape was alien. Vast, treeless plains stretching into an infinite horizon, broken only by the occasional snow fence. It was huge, terrifyingly empty. "America," Hanako replied softly in Japanese. "The interior." "They will kill us when we stop," Keiko said, clutching a small, dirty bundle of belongings. "They are just moving us to a place where the ground is soft enough to dig." "Quiet," Hanako commanded, though her own heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She smoothed the skirt of her dirty civilian dress. If they wanted us dead, they would not have wasted the coal to heat this train. A heavy door at the end of the car slid open. The chatter of the 50 women in the car died instantly. 2 MP guards walked in. They were giants, fed on beef and milk, their uniforms crisp despite the travel. One of them carried a crate. Hanako stiffened, waiting for the shouting, the rifle butts. The guard set the crate down with a thud. He popped the lid. The smell of oranges, sharp, citric, impossible, cut through the stale air. "Rations," the guard said, his voice bored. He tossed an orange to the woman nearest him. She flinched as if it were a grenade. The fruit rolled on the floor, bright orange against the gray dust. The guard rolled his eyes. "Eat. Chow. Food." He mimed eating. Hanako watched the orange rock gently with the motion of the train. Fresh fruit. In the middle of nowhere, in the middle of a war. In Tokyo, an orange was a memory. Here, it was tossed at prisoners by a bored giant. The train whistled, a lonely, powerful sound that echoed across the empty continent. Hanako picked up the orange. It was cold and heavy. "Eat, Keiko," she whispered, peeling the skin. "We need strength for whatever comes next." But as the zest sprayed into the air, Hanako felt a new kind of fear. It wasn't the fear of death. It was the fear of a monster so large, so rich, that it could afford to be kind to its enemies. Camp McCoy, Processing Center. 2 hours after arrival, the ground did not stop moving, even though the train had. Hanako felt the phantom rhythm of the rails in her knees as she stood in line inside the massive processing hangar. The building was a cavern of wood and light, smelling of wet wool, disinfectant, and ink. "Next!" a voice barked. Hanako shuffled forward. The line of women moved with the fluidity of a conveyor belt. At the head sat a row of wooden desks, manned by clerks in khaki shirts with sleeves rolled to the elbows. Typewriters clattered like machine gun fire. Clack, clack, ding, relentless and loud. She stepped up to the desk. The soldier didn't look up. He slid a piece of paper forward. "W.D. Ago, Form 21. "Name?" he asked. Hanako stared blankly, feigning the mute confusion of a peasant. If they knew she spoke English, if they knew she had typed inventory lists for the Imperial Navy, they would use her. They would make her an interpreter, a traitor in the eyes of the other women. "Yamada," she stuttered, bowing slightly. "Hanako." The soldier typed it out. Clack, clack, clack. "Date of birth?" She remained silent, tilting her head. The soldier sighed, a long, weary exhalation that smelled of coffee. He looked up for the first time. His eyes weren't angry. They were bored. He reached out and grabbed her hands. Hanako flinched, pulling back, but his grip was firm. He wasn't hurting her. He was inspecting her. He turned her palms up, running a thumb over the calluses on her fingertips. The marks of a typist, not a field laborer. He looked at her fingernails, clean despite the journey. "Soft hands," he muttered to the corporal next to him. "Not a farm girl. Dexterity is high." He released her and stamped the form with a heavy thud. "Light industrial." "Take her to Section 4, the soldier said, handing the form to a guard. "Textiles." Hanako's heart seized. "Industrial." The word conjured images of the heavy steel mills in Manchuria, soot-stained faces, blast furnaces, bodies broken by falling gears. Were they sending her to shovel coal? To forge steel for the bombs that would fall on Tokyo? "No industrial," she whispered in Japanese, panic cracking her mask. "Please." The guard didn't understand. He simply pointed to a door at the far end of the hangar. "Move out, 24J. That was her name now, not Hanako. 24J. She was marched out of the warm hangar into the biting Wisconsin wind. The camp stretched out like a city, grid perfect and electric lit. They passed rows of identical white barracks, distinct only by numbers stenciled in black. As they approached Block 4, a sound began to bleed through the wooden walls. It wasn't the clang of hammers or the roar of furnaces. It was a low, collective vibration. Zzt, zzt. It sounded like a hive of giant, angry insects. The guard opened the door, and the hum hit her physically. A wall of mechanical noise that smelled of hot oil and ozone. Hanako stepped across the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind her, sealing her inside the machine. The needle was a silver blur, a piston of terrifying violence. Hanako's foot trembled on the black metal pedal. Too fast. In the first 3 seconds, the Singer 1591 had devoured a foot of white cotton sheeting. The machine didn't hum. It growled. Unlike her mother's treadle machine in Tokyo, which breathed in rhythm with the human body, step, stitch, step, stitch, this beast ran on a potted motor mounted directly to the frame. It didn't care about her rhythm. It demanded she keep up with its hunger. "Watch your fingers, 24J, Corporal Miller shouted over the din of 50 machines running in unison. Hanako lifted her foot abruptly. The machine stopped dead. The silence in front of her was sudden and absolute, though the room around her roared on. She looked at the seam. It was straight. It was tight. It was perfect. And it had taken 4 seconds. Hanako stared at the black cast-iron curve of the machine, the gold scrollwork decals gleaming under the harsh electric lights. A wave of nausea rolled in her gut. In Japan, electricity was rationed. To use it for a household chore was unthinkable. To use it for prisoners was madness. Yet here, a copper wire ran from the wall into the machine, feeding it invisible power that surged through the gear drive. She slid the next pillowcase under the presser foot. Snap. The lever went down. She pressed the pedal, gentler this time. Zest. The fabric flew through. Another perfect seam. Hanako worked. She had to, but her mind rebelled against the ease of it. Labor was supposed to be suffering. Suffering built spirit. Seishin. If the work was this easy, where was the honor? Where was the sacrifice? She looked down the row. 50 Japanese women, heads bowed, were feeding the American machine. They were turning out pillowcases by the hundreds. Stacks of white linen rose like snowbanks on the sorting tables at the end of the aisle. By 14 hours, Hanako reached for the next piece of fabric in her bin. Her hand grasped nothing but the rough wood of the crate bottom. She blinked. She looked at the quota chalkboard. 50 units. She looked at her finished pile. 52. She checked the clock on the wall. It was early afternoon. She was done. Hanako sat back, the vibration of the motor still tingling in her thighs. Panic set in. In the Imperial Navy Logistics Office, if you finished early, you were given more work, or you were beaten for not looking busy. Idle hands were a sign of laziness. She looked around. Corporal Miller was at the far end of the room, inspecting a jam. Hanako quickly grabbed a scrap of cloth from the floor and slid it under the needle, pretending to sew. She dry ran the machine, the needle stabbing empty air, just to look occupied. She was terrifyingly efficient. The American machine had made her so. And now, stripped of the struggle of labor, she was left with the one thing a prisoner feared most: time to think. Time to remember the smoke over Saipan. The floor beneath the cutting table was covered in snow. It wasn't ice, but triangles of white cotton, the offcuts from the patterned stamping machine. In Tokyo, a piece of cloth the size of a hand was precious. It could patch a knee. It could be sewn together with others to make a lining for a helmet. It was wealth. Hanako glanced around. Corporal Miller was near the door, logging the output count. Slowly, carefully, Hanako slid off her stool. She knelt on the pine floor, pretending to tie the straw laces of her sandal. Her hands shot out, snatching a handful of the white triangles. She shoved them into the deep pocket of her apron. She grabbed another handful. The cotton was thick, high-quality twill, far superior to the coarse sufu, staple fiber fabric her sisters wore back home. "Hey, you! 24J!" The shout cracked like a whip. Hanako froze. Her hand was still half buried in the pile of scraps. She slowly stood up, trembling. She had been caught stealing. In the Imperial Navy, theft of supplies was punishable by severe beating, sometimes execution. Corporal Miller marched over, her boots thudding heavily. She stopped inches from Hanako. "What are you doing down there?" Hanako bowed her head, pulling the crumpled scraps from her pocket. She held them out in both hands, offering them back like a penitent offering a sacrifice. "I save," Hanako whispered, her throat dry. "For patch, for fix." Miller looked at the scraps in Hanako's trembling hands. Then she looked at the pile on the floor. She frowned, not in anger, but in genuine confusion. "Save?" Miller asked. She reached out and slapped Hanako's hands, not hard, but dismissively. The scraps fluttered to the floor. "That's trash, Yamada. Garbage." "Garbage?" Hanako repeated the word. It tasted wrong. Good cotton, strong. Miller huffed, grabbing a broom leaning against a pillar. She swept the pile of pristine white triangles into a dustpan with aggressive strokes. It slows down the sweepers. It's fire kindling. We don't patch here. We make new. She pointed to the loading bay doors. Through the glass, Hanako saw a forklift moving a pallet. On it sat a bale of raw cotton, so large it would have filled Hanako's entire living room in Saipan. Stenciled on the side in black ink were the letters USQMC, Quartermaster Corps. Behind it was another bale, and another, a wall of cotton. "Dump it in the bin," Miller ordered, pointing to the waste barrel. "And get back to the machine. We have fresh bolts coming in." Hanako dropped the scraps into the bin. She stared at them, enough cloth to clothe a child, sitting among the dust and gum wrappers. A cold realization settled in her chest, heavier than fear. The Americans didn't just have better machines. They had so much material that they could afford to throw it away. Japan was fighting to save every grain of rice, every inch of thread. The Americans were fighting a war of waste. How could spirit defeat a nation that treated cotton like dirt? 22 hours. Barracks. 4. The lights were out, but the barracks were never truly dark. The perimeter searchlights swept across the frosted windows in a rhythmic, blinding cadence. Sweep. Darkness. Sweep. Darkness. Hanako lay on her cot, staring at the ceiling rafters. Under her pillow was a small booklet of canteen coupons, 80 cents worth. Enough for chocolate, soap, or writing paper. It was the wage of her collaboration. A shadow detached itself from the bunk opposite hers. It was Satoko, a severe woman whose husband had been a major in the Kwantung Army. Satoko did not sew fast. She sewed with a deliberate, agonizing slowness that bordered on insubordination. Satoko crouched by Hanako's bed, her voice a hiss, barely audible over the wind outside. "You enjoy their machines, Yamada-san?" Hanako stiffened. "I do my duty. I work to eat." "You work to help them," Satoko spat, the words low and venomous. "I watched you today. 52 units. You hum along with the motor. You have forgotten who you are." "I have forgotten nothing," Hanako whispered back, clutching the blanket. "But did you see the cotton? Did you see how much they have? We cannot defeat them by sewing slower." Satoko grabbed Hanako's wrist. Her grip was iron. "It is not about defeating them with math. It is about Seishin, spirit. Every pillowcase you make comforts an enemy soldier. Every minute you save the machine is a minute they use to kill our brothers." Satoko pressed something cold into Hanako's palm. It was a small, rusted nail, pulled from a loose floorboard. "Tomorrow," Satoko commanded, "drop it in the gear drive. Or jam the bobbin case. Snap the needle. Do something to show you are still Japanese." Satoko released her hand and vanished back into the shadows as the searchlight swept the room again. Hanako lay still, the rusted nail biting into her palm. Her heart pounded. Satoko's logic was the logic of the Empire. Death before dishonor. Resistance at any cost. But Hanako's mind drifted back to the mountain of white scraps in the bin. If she broke the machine, the Americans wouldn't scream. They wouldn't despair. They would just replace it. They had warehouses of parts. They had mechanics. Breaking the Singer 1591 wouldn't hurt the United States Army. It would only get Hanako thrown into the brig. It was a futile gesture, like throwing a pebble at a tank. And yet, the nail felt heavy. It felt like duty. The next morning, the workshop roared to life. Hanako sat at her station. She threaded the needle. Her fingers trembled. She looked at the exposed slot near the bobbin winder. The nail was in her apron pocket. "Just one drop," the voice of her ancestors whispered. "Stop the gear." She reached for the pocket. Crack. A loud metallic snap echoed from 3 rows down. Smoke hissed up. Someone else had done it. The crack had come from Satoko's station. The older woman sat stoically, hands folded in her lap, as the needle lay shattered in 3 pieces on the throat plate. "Machine down!" Miller yelled. Hanako flinched. In the jolt of fear, her foot convulsed on her own pedal. Her singer surged forward, the feed dogs biting hard into a thick seam of canvas. Grr clunk. Hanako's machine seized. The sudden stop nearly threw her forward. The motor hummed angrily, locked against a jam deep in the shuttle race. Silence rippled outward from her station. Hanako stopped breathing. 2 machines down in 10 seconds. It looked like a coordinated revolt. She pulled her hands back as if the black metal was red hot. In Saipan, when a truck engine failed, the driver was beaten with a cane for lack of maintenance spirit. Here, she had just broken a piece of American property. Heavy boots approached. It wasn't Miller. It was a man. Hanako squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the blow to the back of her head. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. "I am sorry, Mother. I am sorry." "All right, scoot back, sister." The voice was casual. Chewing gum, casual. Hanako opened one eye. A young private in grease-stained denims was standing over her. He didn't have a baton. He had a canvas tool roll. He nudged her stool with his boot. "Move." Hanako scrambled back, trembling. The soldier sat down at her machine. He didn't scream. He didn't ask why it happened. He pulled a screwdriver from his pocket, spun 2 screws, and popped the throat plate off. "Thread jam in the hook assembly," he muttered to no one, pulling out a bird's nest of tangled thread with pliers. He looked at the bobbin case. It was scratched. He didn't try to file it down. He didn't try to repair it. He simply reached into his pouch and pulled out a brand new, oil-glistening shuttle assembly. He tossed the old one into a trash can like it was an apple core. Click, snap, whir. He pressed the pedal. The machine roared to life, smooth and perfect. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag. The whole process had taken 90 seconds. "Good to go," he said, popping a bubble of gum. He walked over to Satoko's station to repeat the miracle. Hanako stared at the trash can. The part he had thrown away was made of precision-milled steel. It could have been fixed. But they didn't care. They didn't need to care. The nail in her pocket felt heavier than lead. It was useless. You couldn't sabotage this enemy. If you broke a machine, they birthed a new part from an infinite metal womb. The spirit of the machine was immortal because the Americans had endless spares. "Attention!" Miller's voice boomed over the PA system, cutting through Hanako's daze. "We have a priority 1 order from the War Department. Hospital gowns, Pacific Theater. The truck leaves at 1800. No chow until the quota is met." Hanako looked at the machine. It hummed, waiting for her. It wasn't an enemy. It was a force of nature. And if she didn't ride it, she would be crushed. The workshop had become a blur of motion and noise. 30 minutes! Miller's voice cut through the air, sharp and unyielding. Hanako didn't look up. Her world had narrowed to the 3 inches of steel plate under her needle. The Singer, 1591, was hot to the touch, the motor housing radiating warmth against her leg. She was no longer fighting the machine. She was fused with it. Slide, press, zust, cut. She tossed a finished gown onto the pile. It was heavy, stiff cotton, stamped with the caduceus of the U.S. Army Medical Department. She risked a glance to her left. Satoko was drowning. The older woman's hands were shaking. Her pile of unsewn fabric was a mountain compared to the molehill of her finished work. Satoko wasn't sabotaging anymore. She was simply broken. Her eyes were glazed, her movements jerky and uncoordinated. "She's not going to make it," Keiko whispered from the station to the right, panic rising in her voice. If she fails, they cut the heating. Old Mrs. Tanaka won't survive a night without heat. Hanako looked at Miller. The corporal was walking down the row, checking tallies. She was 5 stations away. Hanako made a decision. It wasn't a decision for the Emperor. It wasn't a decision for America. It was for the women in the barracks. "Give it to me," Hanako hissed. She didn't wait for Satoko to answer. She reached over and grabbed a thick stack of cut fabric from Satoko's bin, dragging it to her own. "Yamada," Satoko gasped. "You cannot—" "Feed me the thread," Hanako commanded, her voice dropping into the lower register of an officer. "Do not talk. Just keep the spools coming." Hanako stomped on the pedal. She floored it. The machine screamed. The needle became invisible. Hanako's hands moved with a dexterity that terrified her, guiding the complex curves of the armholes, the long straightaways of the hem. She wasn't sewing. She was attacking the fabric. Zzzzt! 1 gown. 10 seconds. Zzzzt! Another. The vibration rattled her teeth. The smell of hot oil was choking, but the rhythm took over. This was the American secret, she realized. It wasn't just the machine, it was the flow. They didn't stop. They didn't contemplate. They just produced. Miller was 2 stations away. Hanako threw the last gown onto the pile just as Miller's shadow fell over her desk. The corporal stopped. She looked at Hanako's sweating face. She looked at the empty bin. She looked at the towering stack of finished gowns. Far more than one woman should have been able to produce. Miller looked at Satoko, who was trembling, holding a spool of olive drab thread like a lifeline. The corporal remained silent for a long moment. She picked up the top gown from Hanako's pile. She checked the seams. "Pass," Miller said, her voice flat. She marked the clipboard. "All units, power down." The hum died. 50 motors spun down into silence. Hanako slumped over her machine, her chest heaving. Her legs felt like jelly. She had saved the heat. She had saved the night. But as she looked at the mountain of medical gowns she had just created, a cold thought pierced her exhaustion. These weren't for prisoners. These were for the Pacific, for the field hospitals on islands like Saipan. She had just used American electricity to stitch American armor that would heal the men shooting at her brothers. 20 bus hours. Barracks. 4. The barracks were warm. The radiators hissed softly, a sound of luxury that felt almost criminal. Hanako sat on the edge of her bunk. In her lap lay a piece of stiff paper. American Red Cross message form 1616. She held a pencil, but the graphite hovered millimeters above the line. She had 25 words. That was the rule. 25 words to explain to her mother in Tokyo that she was alive, that she was eating oranges, and that she was sleeping in a heated room while Japan burned. She looked around the room. The women were asleep, exhausted by the surge. Satoko lay facing the wall, her shoulders still hunched in shame. Hanako closed her eyes. The sound of the workshop was gone, but the vibration remained in her fingertips. The hum. She thought back to that first moment. The cold terror when she saw the black Singer machine. She had thought it was a torture device. She had been wrong. It was a teacher. It had taught her that the enemy did not hate her. The enemy simply did not mind her. To the Americans, she was not a demon to be slain. She was just another unit of labor to be optimized. They fed her so she could work. They heated her room so her fingers wouldn't stiffen. They fixed her machine instantly because downtime was inefficient. That was the horror. That was the truth she could never write in a letter. Japan was fighting a war of blood and soul, screaming banzai into the face of death. America was fighting a war of inventory management. Hanako looked at the blank paper. If she wrote the truth? "Mother, we cannot win. They have machines that sew faster than we can think. The sensors would burn it." Or worse, her mother would read it and die of shame. So, Hanako lied. She lied with the grace of a dutiful daughter. She pressed the pencil to the paper. I am safe. The work is light. I eat rice and fruit. Do not worry. The winter here is cold, but the rooms are warm. She counted. 24 words. She signed her name, not 24J, but Hanako. She set the paper on the small wooden crate she used as a nightstand. Through the frosted window, the searchlight swept past, briefly illuminating the room in a wash of artificial daylight. Hanako lay back and pulled the wool blanket up to her chin. She listened to the silence of the Wisconsin night, but deep in the walls, faint and distant, she could hear the hum of the camp's electric generator. It never stopped. It never slept. It never got tired. Hanako closed her eyes and let the hum carry her into a dreamless sleep. The war would end soon. She knew that now, and when it did, the world would belong to those who could keep the machines running.